Now we come to chapter 5. Just to remind you, Pip, Mrs. Joe, and the guests are having Christmas dinner. They are about, or they think they are about, to eat Mr. Pumblechook's pork pie. Pip is still in an agony of guilt because, of course, he stole the pie to give it to the convict. And he thinks that very soon his theft will be discovered and he will be in the worst trouble of his life. However, all of a sudden, there's a file of soldiers standing at the door of the forge. The apparition of a file of soldiers ringing down the butt ends of their loaded muskets on our doorstep caused the dinner party to rise from the table in confusion and caused Mrs. Joe to re-enter the kitchen empty-handed, to stop and stare in her wondering lament of, "Gracious goodness, good gracious me, what's gone? And with the pie?" The sergeant and I were in the kitchen when Mrs. Joe stood staring, at which crisis I partially recovered the use of my senses. It was the sergeant who had spoken to me, and he was now looking around at the company with his handcuffs invitingly extended towards them in his right hand and his left on my shoulder.
"Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," said the sergeant, "but as I have mentioned at the door to this smart young shaver here,"
which he hadn't,
"I am on a chase in the name of the king, and I want the blacksmith."
"And pray, what might you want him for?" retorted my sister, quick to resent his being wanted at all.
"Mrs.," returned the gallant sergeant, "speaking for myself, I should reply, the honour and pleasure of his fine wife's acquaintance. Speaking for the king, I answer, a little job done."
This was received as rather neat in the sergeant, insomuch that Mr. Pumblechook cried audibly,
"Oh, good again!" "You see, blacksmith,"
said the sergeant, who by this time had picked out Joe with his eye,
we've had an accident with these, and I find the lock of one of them goes wrong, and the coupling end don't act pretty. As they're wanted for immediate service, will you throw your eye over them?"
Joe threw his eye over them and pronounced that the job would necessitate the lighting of his forge fire and would take nearer 2 hours than 1.
"Oh, will it? Oh, then will you set about it at once, blacksmith? As it's His Majesty's service, and if my men can beat a hand anywhere, they'll make themselves useful."
With that, he called to his men, who came trooping into the kitchen one after another and piled their arms in a corner, and then they stood about, as soldiers do, now with their hands loosely clasped before them, now resting on a knee or a shoulder, now easing a belt or a pouch, now opening the door to spit stiffly over their high stocks out into the yard. All these things I saw without knowing that I saw them, for I was still in an agony of apprehension, but beginning to perceive that the handcuffs were not for me, and that the military had so far got the better of the pie as to put it in the background, I collected a little more of my scattered wits.
"Would you give me the time?"
said the sergeant, addressing himself to Mr. Pumblechook, as to a man whose appreciative powers justified the inference that he was equal to the time.
"It's just gone 2:30. "Oh, that's not so bad," said the sergeant, reflecting. "Even if I was forced to halt here nigh 2 hours, that would do. How far might you call yourselves from the marshes hereabouts? Not above a mile, I reckon."
"Just a mile," retorted my sister.
"Oh, that'll do. We'll begin to close in on 'em about dusk. A little before dusk, my orders are. That'll do." "Convicts, sergeant?"
asked Mr. Wopsle, in a matter-of-fact kind of way.
Aye, returned the sergeant. 2 of them. They're pretty well known to be out on the marshes still, and they won't try to get clear of them before dusk. Anybody here see anything of such game?
Everybody, myself excepted, said no with confidence. Nobody thought of me.
Well, said the sergeant, they'll find themselves trapped in a circle. I expect sooner than they count on. Now, blacksmith, if you're ready, His Majesty the King is.
Joe had his coat and waistcoat and cravat off and his leather apron on and passed into the forge. One of the soldiers opened its wooden windows, another lighted the fire, another got to at the bellows, the rest stood round the blaze, which was soon roaring. Then Joe began to hammer and clink, and we all looked on. The interest of the impending pursuit not only absorbed the general attention, but made my sister quite liberal. She drew a pitcher of beer from the cask for the soldiers and invited the sergeant to take a glass of brandy, but Mr. Pumblechook said sharply,
Give him wine, mum, give him wine. I'll engage there's no tar in that.
So the sergeant thanked him and said that he preferred his drink without tar, so he would take wine, if that was equally convenient. When it was given him, he drank His Majesty's health and the compliments of the season, and took it all in a mouthful and smacked his lips.
Good stuff, eh, Sergeant?
Asked Mr. Pumblechook.
I'll tell you something, returned the sergeant. I suspect that stuff's of your providing.
Mr. Pumblechook, with a fat sort of laugh, said,
Why? Because, returned the sergeant, clapping him on the shoulder, you're a man who knows what's what. Oh, do you think so?
said Mr. Pumblechook with his former laugh.
With you? I'll have a glass of wine. Ob and nob, returned the sergeant. The top of mine to the foot of yours, the foot of yours to the top of mine. Ring once, ring twice, the best tune on musical glasses. Your health, Sergeant. May you live 1,000 years, and may you never be a worse judge of the right sort than you are at the present moment of your life. With you, ob and nob, returned the sergeant.
The sergeant tossed off his glass again and seemed quite ready for another glass. I noticed that Mr. Pumblechook, in his hospitality, appeared to forget that he had made a present of the wine, but took the bottle from Mrs. Joe and had all the credit of handing it about with a gush of joviality. Even I got some, and he was so very free with the wine that he even called for the other bottle and handed that about with the same liberality when the first was gone. As I watched them, while they all stood clustering about the forge, enjoying themselves so much, I thought what a terrible good sauce for a dinner my fugitive friend was on the marshes. They hadn't enjoyed themselves a quarter so much before the entertainment was brightened with the excitement he furnished. And now, when they were all in lively anticipation of the 2 villains being taken, and when the bellows seemed to roar for the fugitives, the fire to flare for them, the smoke to hurry away in pursuit of them, Joe to hammer and clink for them, and all the murky shadows on the wall to shake at them in menace, as the blaze grew and sank and the red-hot sparks dropped and died, the pale afternoon outside almost seemed in my pitying young fancy to have turned pale on their account. Poor wretches. At last, Joe's job was done, and the ringing and the roaring stopped. As Joe got on his coat, he mustered courage to propose that some of us should go down with the soldiers and see what came of the hunt. Mr. Pumblechook and Mr. Hubble declined on plea of a pipe and the ladies' society, but Mr. Wopsle said he would go if Joe would go. Joe said he was agreeable and would take me if Mrs. Joe approved. We never should have got leave to go, I'm sure, but for Mrs. Joe's curiosity to know all about it and how it ended. As it was, she merely stipulated, "If you bring the boy back with his head blown to bits by a musket, don't look at me to put it back together again." The sergeant took a polite leave of the ladies and parted from Mr. Pumblechook as to a comrade, though I doubt if he were fully sensible of that gentleman's merits under arid conditions, as when something moist was going around. His men resumed their muskets and fell in. Mr. Wopsle, Joe, and I received strict charge to keep in the rear and to speak no word after we reached the marshes. When we were all out in the raw air and were steady moving towards our business, I treasonably whispered to Joe, I hope, Joe, we shan't find them." And Joe whispered to me, "I'd give a shilling if they'd cut and run." We were joined by no stragglers from the village, for the weather was cold and threatening, the way dreary, the footing bad, darkness coming on, and people had good fires indoors and were keeping the day. A few faces hurried to glowing windows and looked after us, but none came out. We passed the finger post and held straight for the churchyard. There we stopped a few minutes by a signal from the sergeant's hand, while 2 or 3 of his men dispersed themselves amongst the graves, and also examined the porch. They came in again without finding anything, and then we struck out onto the marshes, the open marshes, through the gate at the side of the churchyard. A bitter sleet came rattling against us here on the east wind, and Joe took me on his back. Now that we were out on the open, dismal wilderness, where they little thought I had been 8 or 9 hours before and had seen the men in hiding, I considered for the first time with great dread, if we should come upon them, would my particular convict suppose that it was I who had brought the soldiers here? He'd asked me if I was a deceiving imp, and he'd said that I should be a fierce young hound if I joined the hunt against him. Would he believe me that I was both imp and hound in treacherous earnest, and I had not betrayed him? It was no use asking myself that question now. There I was on Joe's back, and there was Joe beneath me, charging at the ditches like a hunter and stimulating Mr. Wopsle not to tumble his Roman nose and keep up with us. The soldiers were out in front of us, extending in a pretty wide line with an interval between man and man. We were taking the course I had begun with, and from which I had diverged in the mist. Either the mist was not out again yet, or the wind had dispelled it. Under the low red glare of sunset, the beacon and the gibbet and the mound at the battery and the opposite shore of the river were plain, though all a watery lead colour. With my heart thumping like a blacksmith at Joe's broad shoulder, I looked all about for the sign, any sign of the convicts. I could see none, I could hear none. Mr. Wopsle had greatly alarmed me more than once by his blowing hard breathing, but I knew the sounds of this, and I could disassociate them from the object of the pursuit. I got a dreadful start when I thought I heard the files still going, but it was only a sheep bell. The sheep stopped in their eating and looked timidly at us, and the cattle, their heads turned round from the wind and sleet, stared angrily at us, as if they held us responsible for both the sleet and the wind. But except for these things, and the shudder of the dying day in every blade of grass, there was no break in the bleak stillness of the marshes. The soldiers were moving on in the direction of the old battery, and we were moving on a little way behind them, when all of a sudden we all stopped. For there reached us on the wings of the wind and rain what sounded like a loud shout. It was repeated. It was at a distance towards the east, but it was long and loud. No, it seemed to be more than one shout, perhaps two, raised together, if one might judge from the confusion in the sound. To this effect the sergeant and the nearest men were speaking under their breath when Joe and I came up. After a moment's listening, Joe, who was a good judge, agreed, and Mr. Wopsle, who was a bad judge, also agreed. The sergeant, the decisive man, ordered that the sound should not be answered, but that the course should be changed, and that his men should make towards it at the double. So we slanted to the right where the wind east was, and Joe pounded away so wonderfully that I had to hold on tight to keep my seat. It was a run now indeed, and what Joe called in the only two words he spoke all the time, a winder. Down banks and up banks, over gates and splashing into dikes and breaking among coarse rushes, no man cared where he went. As we came nearer to the shouting, it became more and more apparent that it was made by more than one voice. Sometimes it appeared to stop altogether, and then the soldiers stopped. When it broke out again, the soldiers made for it with a greater rate than ever, and we after them. After a while we had so run it down that we could hear one voice calling, "Murder!" and another voice, "Convicts! Runaways! Guard! This way for the runaway convicts!" Then both voices would seem to be stifled in a struggle, and then would break out again. And when it had come to this, the soldiers ran like deer, and Joe too. The sergeant ran in first when we'd run the noise quite down, and two of his men ran in close upon him. Their pieces were cocked and levelled when we all ran in. "Here are both men," panted the sergeant, struggling at the bottom ditch. "Surrender, you two! Confound you for wild beasts! Come a thunder!" Water was splashing and mud was flying and oaths were being sworn and blows were being struck when some more men went down into the ditch to help the sergeant and dragged out separately my convict and the other one. Both were bleeding and panting and execrating and struggling, but of course I knew them both directly. "Mind," said my convict, wiping blood from his face with his ragged sleeves and shaking torn hair from his fingers. "I took him. I gave him up to you. Mind that." "There's not much to be particular about," said the sergeant. "It's small good for you, my man, being in the same plight yourself, and caves there." "I don't expect it'll do me any good. I don't want it to do me any good," said my convict, with a greedy laugh. "Ha ha! I took him. He knows it. That's enough for me." The other convict was livid to look at, and in addition to the old bruise on his left side, there seemed to be bruises all over. He couldn't so much as get his breath to speak until they were both separately handcuffed, but leaned upon a soldier to keep himself from falling. "Take notice, guard, he tried to murder me," were his first words. "Try to murder him?" said my convict disdainfully. "Try it and not do it? I took him, and I've given him up. That's what I've done. I not only prevented him to get off the marshes, but I dragged him here, dragged him this far on his way back. He's a gentleman, if you please, this villain. Now, the Alps has got its gentleman again, through me. Murder him? Worth my while, too, to murder him, when I could do worse but drag him back." The other one still gasped. He tried to murder me. Bear witness." "Looky here," said my convict to the sergeant. "Single-handed I got clear of the prison ship. I made a dash and I done it. I could have got clear of these death-cold flats likewise. Look at my leg. You won't find much iron on it. If I hadn't made the discovery that he was here, let him go free. Let him profit by the means as I've found out. Let him make a tool of me afresh and again? Once more? No, no, no! If I died at the bottom there. And he made an emphatic swing at the ditch with his manacled hands. I'd have held to him with that grip that you should have been safe to find him in my hold. The other fugitive, who was evidently in extreme horror of his companion, repeated, He tried to murder me. I should have been a dead man if you hadn't have come up. He lies, said my convict with fierce energy. He's a born liar. He'll die a liar. Look at his face. Ain't it written there? Let him turn those eyes on me. I defy him to do it. The other, with an effort at a scornful smile, which could not, however, collect the nervous working of his mouth into any set expression, looked at the soldiers and looked about at the marshes and at the sky, but certainly didn't look at the speaker. Do you see him? Pursued my convict. Do you see what a villain he is? Do you see those grovelling and wandering eyes? That's how he looked at me when we was tried together. He never looked at me. The other, always working his dry lips and turning his eyes restlessly about him far and near, did at last turn them for a moment on the speaker with the words, Well, you're not much to look at, are you? And with a half-taunting glance at the bound hands. At that point, my convict became so frantically exasperated that he would have rushed upon him except for the interposition of the soldiers. Didn't I tell you, said the other convict, that he would murder me if he could? And any of you can see how he's shaking there with rage. As he said this, he shook with fear, and there broke out upon his lips curious white flakes like thin snow. Enough of this parley, said the sergeant. Light those torches. As one of the soldiers who carried a basket in lieu of a gun went down on his knee to open it, my convict looked round him and for the first time saw me. I had alighted from Joe's back on the brink of the ditch when we came up, and hadn't moved since. I looked at him eagerly when he looked at me, and slightly moved my hands and shook my head. I had been waiting for him to see me that I might try to assure him of my innocence. It was not at all expressed to me that he even comprehended my intention, for he gave me a look that I didn't understand. And it all passed in a moment. But if he had looked at me for an hour or for a day, I couldn't have remembered his face ever afterwards as ever having been more attentive. The soldier with the basket soon got the light, and lighted the 3 or 4 torches, and took one himself and distributed the others. It had been almost dark before, but now it was quite dark, and soon after very dark. Before we departed from that spot, 4 soldiers, standing in a ring, fired twice into the air. Presently we saw other torches kindled at some distance behind us, and others on the marshes on the opposite bank of the river. All right, said the sergeant. March! We hadn't gone far when 3 cannon were fired ahead of us with a sound that seemed to burst something inside my ear. You're expected on board, said the sergeant to my convict. And as they limped along in the midst of the muskets, we all marched together. We couldn't go fast because of the convicts' lameness. They were so spent that 2 or 3 times we had to halt while they rested. After an hour or so of this travelling, we came to a rough wooden hut and a landing place. There was a guard in the hut, and they challenged, and the sergeant answered. Then we went into the hut, where there was a smell of tobacco and whitewash, and a bright fire, and a lamp, and a stand of muskets, and a drum, and a low wooden bedstead, like an overgrown mangle without the machinery, capable of holding about a dozen soldiers at once. 3 or 4 soldiers lay upon it in their great coats, and they weren't much interested in us, but just lifted their heads and took a sleepy stare, and then lay down again. The sergeant made some kind of report and some entry in a book, and then the convict, whom I call the other convict, was drafted off with his guard to go on board first. My convict never looked at me except that once. While we stood in the hut, he stood before the fire, looking thoughtfully at it, and putting up his feet by turns on the hob, looking thoughtfully at them, as if he pitied them for their recent adventures. Suddenly he turned to the sergeant and remarked,
"I wish to say something respecting this escape. It may prevent some persons laying under suspicion along of me." "You say what you like," returned the sergeant, standing coolly, looking at him with both arms folded. "But you've no call to say it here. You'll have opportunity enough to say all about it and hear all about it before it's done with." I know. But this is another point, a separate matter. A man can't starve, at least I can't. I took some victuals up at the village yonder, where the church stands almost on the marshes. "You mean stole?" said the sergeant. "And I'll tell you where we're from. From the blacksmith's." "Ho-ho!" said the sergeant, staring at Joe.
"Ooh, Pip," said Joe, staring at me.
It was some broken victuals. That's what it was. And a dram of liquor and a pie." "Have you happened to miss such an article as a pie, blacksmith?" asked the sergeant.
"My wife did at the very moment when you came in. Don't you know, Pip?"
"So,"
said my convict, turning his eyes on Joe in a moody manner and without the least glance at me.
"So you're the blacksmith, are you? Well, I'm very sorry to say I've eaten your pie."
"God knows you're welcome to it, as far as ever it was mine," returned Joe, with a saving remembrance of Mrs. Joe. "We don't know what you done, but we wouldn't have you starve to death for it, poor miserable fellow creature, would us, Pip?" The something that I noticed before clicked in the man's throat again, and he turned his back. The boat had returned and his guard were ready, so we followed him onto the landing place made of rough stakes and stones, and saw him put into the boat, which was rowed by a crew of convicts like himself. No one seemed surprised to see him, or interested in seeing him, or glad to see him, or sorry to see him, or spoke a word, except that somebody in the boat growled as if to dogs,
"Give way, you!"
which was the signal for the dip of the oars. By the light of the torches we saw the black hulk lying out a little way from the mud of the shore, like a wicked Noah's Ark, cribbed and barred and moored by massive rusty chains. The prison ship seemed in my young eyes to be ironed with prisoners. We saw the boat go alongside, we saw him taken up and disappear. Then the ends of the torches were flung hissing into the water and went out, as if it were all over with them. Chapter 6. My state of mind regarding the pilfering from which I had been so unexpectedly exonerated did not impel me to frank disclosure. But I hope it had some dregs of good at the bottom of it. I do not recall that I felt any tenderness of conscience in reference to Mrs. Joe, when the fear of being found out was lifted off me, but I loved Joe. I loved him perhaps for no better reason in those early days than because the dear fellow let me love him. and as to him my inner self was not so easily composed. It was much upon my mind, particularly when I first saw him looking about for his file, that I ought to tell Joe the whole truth. Yet I didn't, and for the reason that I mistrusted that if I did, he would think the worse of me than I was. The fear of losing Joe's confidence, and of thenceforth sitting in the chimney corner at night staring directly at my forever lost companion and friend, tied up my tongue. I morbidly represented to myself that if Joe knew it, I never afterwards could see him at the fireside feeling his fair whisker without thinking that he was meditating upon it. That if Joe knew it, I never afterwards could see him glance, however casually, at yesterday's meat or pudding when it came on today's table without thinking that he was debating whether I had been at the pantry. That if Joe knew it, and at any subsequent period of our joint domestic life remarked that his beer was flat or thick, the conviction that he suspected tar in it would bring a rush of blood to my face. In a word, I was too cowardly to do what I knew to be right, as I had been too cowardly to avoid doing what I knew to be wrong. I had had no intercourse with the world at that time, and I imitated none of its many inhabitants who act in this manner. Quite an untaught genius, I made the discovery of the line of action for myself. As I was sleepy before we were away for the prison ship, Joe took me on his back again and carried me home. He must have had a tiresome journey of it, for Mr. Wopsle, being knocked up, was in such a very bad temper that if the church had been open, he would probably have excommunicated the whole expedition, beginning with Joe and myself. As it was, in his lay capacity, he persisted in sitting down in the damp to such an insane extent that when his coat was taken off to be dried at the kitchen fire, the circumstantial evidence of his trousers would have hanged him if it had been a capital offence. By that time I was staggering on the kitchen floor like a little drunkard, though having been newly set upon my feet, and through having been fast asleep, and through waking in the heat of the lights and noise of the tongues, as I came to myself with the aid of a heavy thump between my soldiers and the restorative exclamation, "Yeah! Was there ever such a boy as this?" from my sister, I found Joe telling them about the convict's confession, and all the visitors suggesting different ways by which he had got into the pantry. Mr. Pumblechook made out, after carefully surveying the premises, that he had first got upon the roof of the forge, and had then got upon the roof of the house, and had then let himself down into the kitchen through the chimney by a rope made of his bedding into strips. And as Mr. Pumblechook was very positive and drove his own chaise cart over everybody, it was agreed that it must be so. Mr. Wopsle, indeed, wildly cried out, "No!" with the feeble malice of a tired man, but as he had no theory and no coat on, he was unanimously set at naught, not to mention his smoking hard behind as he stood with his back to the kitchen fire to draw the damp out, which was not calculated to inspire confidence. This was all I heard that night before my sister clutched me as a sunderous offence to the company's eyesight, and assisted me up to bed with such a strong hand that I seemed to have 50 boots on and to be dangling them all against the edges of the stairs. My state of mind, as I have described it before, lasted long after the subject had died out and had ceased to be mentioned, saving on exceptional circumstances.